In April of 1873, a 30-year-old Indiana farmer named Uriah Oblinger cut a hole 12 feet wide and 14 feet deep into a south slope on his Fillmore County, Nebraska homestead. He framed a front wall from cottonwood logs hauled 6 miles from the Blue River, set a small window in it, hung a plank door, and covered the roof with willow brush, prairie grass, and 2 feet of sod. 3 walls were prairie soil. 1 was logs. His wife Mattie and their daughter Ella, 1 year old, moved in during May. Mattie wrote to her parents a week later. She said the dugout was dry and warm, that she had put up curtains of flour sack cloth, and that she could hear prairie dogs barking through the back wall. The letter is 3 pages long in a small round hand, with a pencil drawing in the margin of the single window and the door, and a note at the bottom asking her mother to send a packet of dried lavender because the house smelled of earth. It is still in a box at the Nebraska State Historical Society, along with about 200 other letters Mattie and Uriah wrote to family members between 1872 and 1880. The dugout was the cheapest house a homesteader could build on the treeless prairie. A full sod house, built above ground with walls made of stacked sod bricks, required between 1 and 2 acres of cut sod, several days of skilled labor from the builder or a hired mason, a substantial timber structure for the roof, and a front and back wall finished in wood. A frame house required lumber hauled in by wagon from a railhead, which in most of central Nebraska in 1873 meant a 2-day trip each way to a sawmill or freight depot, plus the cash to buy the lumber, which was usually not available. A dugout required none of those things. It required a shovel, a pick, a few cottonwood logs for the front wall and the door frame, some prairie grass and willow brush for the roof, and about 2 weeks of one man's labor. The total cash cost of building a dugout on an 1873 homestead was typically under $5 if the builder already had the shovel and the pick. The south-facing slope was the critical feature. A hole cut into the north side of a ridge was cold and dark through the winter because the sun never reached the doorway. Cutting into the east or west side was marginally better, but still exposed to the long winter winds that came down out of the north across the open prairie and swept over the ridge and around the corners. The south side of a ridge, like the Oblinger dugout, was protected from the north wind by the ridge itself, caught the low winter sun through the door and the single window. For most of the hours the sun was above the horizon and stayed noticeably warmer inside than the outside air without any heating at all. Uriah had picked his ridge carefully. His claim had 3 usable slopes, and he had walked all of them with a compass before deciding where to cut. The interior of the first Oblinger dugout was about 12 feet square, which gave it roughly the floor space of a modern bathroom for 2 adults and a child, and later a second child. The ceiling was low, about 6.5 feet at its highest point, and it sloped down toward the back wall, because the roof rested on the logs at the front and directly on the top edge of the dugout pit at the back. The furniture was minimal. A bed built into the back wall on wooden posts, a smaller bed in the corner for Ella, a pine table Uriah had built from the scraps of the cottonwood logs, 2 chairs with woven rush seats, a cast-iron cook stove along the side wall with its pipe going up through the roof, a trunk that held the family's clothes and the letters from Indiana, 2 shelves along the front wall that held the dishes and the flour canister, and a small collection of books, including a Bible, and a copy of the poems of John Greenleaf Whittier that Mattie had brought from her mother's house. Mattie's letters describe the rhythm of life in the dugout with the same plain attention she gave to the weather and the garden and the neighbors. In June of 1873, she wrote that rain had come through the roof in 3 places during a storm, and that she had set pans under the drips. And by August, the first summer had been dry, and the well Uriah was digging had reached 30 feet without hitting water. In November, the first snow came and drifted against the front wall, so that Uriah had to shovel his way out in the morning, and the inside of the dugout was warm with the stove going, and Ella was sitting on the floor playing with a corncob doll. A January 1874 letter records that the temperature outside had dropped to 20 below for 3 days running, and that the inside of the dugout had stayed above freezing even overnight, because the earth walls were holding the heat from the stove and releasing it slowly after the fire had gone out. The physics of a hillside dugout is not complicated. 3 of the 4 walls are surrounded on every side by soil. Soil is a slow-responding thermal insulator, and at a depth of a few feet below the surface, the ground stays close to the average annual temperature of the region, which in Fillmore County, Nebraska, is about 52 degrees Fahrenheit. A dugout with 3 earth walls and an earth-covered roof is therefore being held by the ground on 3 sides at a temperature of roughly 52 degrees year-round, regardless of the air temperature outside. Adding even a small amount of heat inside the dugout, from a cook stove or a body or a lamp, raises the interior air temperature above the 52-degree baseline easily. In the middle of a 20 below Nebraska winter night with no fire going at all, a well-built dugout will stay near 45 degrees inside. With a small fire going, it will stay near 60. The Oblinger dugout was built well, and Mattie's letters confirm that she never once mentioned the water in the wash basin freezing overnight, which was the standard complaint of settlers living in frame houses and poorly built sod houses on the same prairie during the same winters. The dugout was not without drawbacks. The earth walls were subject to the movement of moisture. In a wet spring, the back wall seeped, and Uriah had to dig a shallow drainage trench along the base of it to carry the water away. The sod roof was a haven for mice and snakes and insects, all of which occasionally came down through the ceiling into the living space. Mattie's letters record a bull snake that fell out of the roof onto the dinner table in June of 1874, and a family of mice that were living in the gap between the logs of the front wall in October of the same year. Then the dugout was also dark. The single front window, which was about a foot square and set with 2 panes of glass, Uriah had carried wrapped in a blanket from the town of Crete, admitted enough light to see by during the day, but not enough to read by without a lamp after about 4 in the afternoon in winter. Mattie did most of her writing in the morning, when the low winter sun came through the window at an angle that lit the pine table directly. A well-built dugout also had advantages over a sod house that were not obvious to anyone who had not lived in both. It was quieter. The earth walls absorbed sound rather than reflecting it, and a dugout in a windstorm was almost silent inside, while a sod house with its thinner walls and higher roof rattled and creaked and let in drafts that made the lamp flames jump. It was also safer in the worst weather. A tornado passing over a hillside dugout had nothing to grab hold of except the logs of the front wall, and the logs were usually short enough and set low enough that a tornado's vortex passed above them without damage. There are Nebraska newspaper accounts from the 1870s of sod houses being stripped to the foundation by tornadoes, while the dugout in the next quarter section stood untouched. The people inside the dugouts usually did not even know a tornado had been overhead until they came outside in the morning and saw what had happened to their neighbors. Uriah and Mattie lived in the dugout for almost 3 years. During that time, their second daughter Maggie was born in the back bed of the dugout in the spring of 1874, attended by a neighbor woman who had walked 4 miles across the prairie to help after receiving word from a boy Uriah had sent on horseback at 3 in the morning when Mattie's labor began. The neighbor woman, a German immigrant named Mrs. Huss, had herself given birth to 5 children in a dugout on the next section, 3 of whom were still alive and 2 of whom had died in their first year. From causes she told Mattie she did not understand and had stopped trying to understand. Maggie was healthy. Mattie recovered quickly. The letter Mattie wrote to her mother 2 weeks after the birth described the dugout as a good place to have a baby because it was warm and quiet, and because the earth walls kept out the wind and the noise of the prairie. In the fall of 1875, Uriah started building a sod house on a level piece of ground about 50 yards from the dugout. Because the family had grown, and because he wanted more room, and because the walls of the dugout were starting to slump after 3 winters of freeze and thaw. The sod house was finished in June of 1876. It was 14 by 20 feet, had 3 small windows, a wooden floor, a plastered interior, and a proper chimney. The family moved into it in July. The old dugout was used as a cellar and a smokehouse for another 5 years before it was filled in with soil from the surrounding slope and plowed over. Mattie Oblinger died in July of 1880, 6 years after moving into the sod house, from complications following the birth of a 4th child. She was 36 years old. And the letters she had written from the dugout and from the sod house were kept by her sister in Indiana, who added them to the family's papers, and the whole collection was given to the Nebraska State Historical Society in 1957 by a grandchild who had grown up hearing the stories and who understood that the letters were a primary source for the ordinary life of an ordinary homesteader during the first decade of white settlement on the central Nebraska prairie. The collection has been digitized and is available to researchers. There is a specific quality to the writing in Mattie's letters that is worth noticing. She does not complain. The tone is not dramatized. She was not writing the way a person writes, who expects her words to be read by anyone other than her mother and her sisters. The prairie in her letters is not a challenge to be overcome, or a frontier to be tamed, or a landscape to be described in the lyrical terms that professional writers of the same period were using. It is a place where she has put down a floor of packed earth and hung curtains of flour sacks and is raising her children. The dugout is not a symbol of hardship in her letters. It is a house. She writes about it the way a woman in a brick row house in Philadelphia in 1873 might have written about her parlor, except that her parlor had a bull snake in it in June. The evenness of tone is what makes the letters trustworthy as a record, because a writer who does not reach for effect in the easy places is also not reaching for effect in the hard places. And when Mattie describes a difficult thing in the same plain voice, she uses for an easy one. The difficulty is carried by the facts rather than by the adjectives. The Oblinger letters are unusual, mainly in their quantity and in their survival. They are not unusual in their content. The dugout they describe was the standard first house of thousands of homestead families across Nebraska and Kansas and the Dakotas in the 1860s and 1870s and early 1880s. And the rhythms Mattie describes of her life in the dugout, the leaks and the mice, and the cold winter mornings and the warmth of the stove, and the birth of a child in the back bed, were the rhythms of thousands of other dugouts along the same rivers and on the same prairies at the same time. The photographer Solomon Butcher, who spent almost a decade in the 1880s driving his glass plate camera around Custer County, Nebraska, and photographing the homesteads he found there, left a record of roughly 3,000 prairie families outside their houses. A substantial number of the earliest of his photographs showed dugouts, identifiable by the way the front wall emerges from the slope of a hill, and by the way the sod roof blends into the prairie grass at the back, so that the house almost disappears into the ridge. Butcher himself lived in a dugout for part of his first winter in Custer County in 1880. His own account of it, written years later, mentions that the earth walls kept his glass plate negatives from cracking in the cold, which was his main concern as a photographer, and was not a concern he could have solved by living in any other kind of house available on the prairie at the time. The dugout saved his equipment before it saved him. Butcher's dugout photographs have a common visual feature that took historians some time to notice. The families in front of the dugouts are usually posed with their best clothing and their most valuable possessions brought out and arranged where the camera would see them. A sewing machine carried out into the sunlight, a parlor organ dragged through the doorway and set up on the grass, a family dog on a leather leash, a cow brought around from the pen. The composition is a statement of solvency. It says that the family living in this earth hole is a respectable family with a sewing machine and an organ and a cow, and that the earth hole is temporary, and that a better house is coming as soon as the next 3 crops come in. The statement was usually accurate. Most dugout families moved into a sod house or a frame house within 5 years. A few never did. A very small number of the Butcher photographs show older families in front of older dugouts with no sign of a planned improvement, and those photographs are the hardest ones to look at, because the silent calculation they record is that this family is going to live in this dirt chamber until the end. Uriah Oblinger outlived his wife by 28 years. He raised the 3 surviving children in the sod house, married a second wife in 1882, moved the family to a frame house in 1891, and died in 1908 at the age of 65. He wrote a short memoir of his homesteading years in 1903, which was never published, and in the memoir he described the dugout where he and Mattie had spent their first 3 years on the prairie as the best house he ever had. Because the walls were warm in winter and cool in summer, and because the earth never complained when the wind was blowing, and because that was where his children had been born, and where he had learned what it took to live on the land without anything behind him. The memoir is in the same collection as the letters in the archives at Lincoln, and the sentence about the dugout walls being warm in winter has been quoted in almost every subsequent history of prairie homesteading, because it is the shortest and most honest summary anyone has ever written of what those buried chambers actually were. the dugouts themselves are all gone. Every one of them that was left standing after the family moved out was eventually filled in, because a collapsing dugout on a working farm was a hazard to cattle and to children, and because the roof sod would catch fire in a grass fire if it dried out, and because the square of disturbed earth was always slightly richer than the surrounding soil and could be plowed into a better piece of ground. What remains of them is a scatter of archaeological shadows in fields across central Nebraska, identifiable to a trained eye by the squared-off depressions in otherwise smooth topography, and a few hundred photographs by Butcher and others, and a few thousand letters like Matty Oblinger's, and the memory in the soil itself, which has now been plowed and planted and harvested for 150 springs, without ever quite forgetting where the walls used to be. Farmers who have worked the ground for generations sometimes point out to visitors a rectangle in a field that grows slightly taller corn than the rows on either side, and they explain that there used to be a dugout there, and that the dugout is still feeding the field, because the crushed sod of its roof and the wood of its front wall and the ash of its long cold stove all ended up in the topsoil when the cavity was plowed over. The prairie composts its own memory. If you want more stories like this one, the full playlist is right here.